Welcome to Preserving Valor, a podcast dedicated to saving the personal stories of veterans. My name is Jay Vissers. This is the fourth episode in the story of U.S. Army veteran Brian Vissers. We left off with Brian telling us some humorous stories from his service. However, Brian also lived through some traumatic events, which left him with some lifelong issues.
I left Vietnam because I was shot. I came home on a C-141 and to Fort Ord, California. And I remember my first night at Fort Ord, there was an old retired lieutenant colonel in the room with me. And we were in a facility that was a World War II hospital. So there wasn't anything fancy. In fact, much of the hospital, you could feel the draft coming through the wall because there was no insulation or interior wall surface. And we're sitting there, it was in the evening, and all of a sudden gunfire erupted up the street. And I was out of bed and on the floor and rolling under the bed just that quick. And he kind of chuckled, my roommate, and I kind of looked up at him and he says, "You'll be okay." He said, "I understand what you're going through." He said, "But we're having a little trouble with race riots here at Fort Ord." And that's what had happened. There was somebody up the street started shooting at the MPs and they returned fire. And so that was my first night back in CONUS in continental U.S.
Brian left the hospital and Fort Ord shortly before the full-blown race riot on June 27, 1971. The base hosted the band Canned Heat, only for a quarrel to break out in a race riot that left a bus overturned and a barracks ablaze.
And I had already called Esther to come pick me up. And I couldn't get released from the hospital. They anticipated my release on a Monday. And so this happened Friday night, the gunfire. Saturday was going through things where I had Doc come in and examine my leg and all that kind of stuff. And Sunday or Saturday afternoon, I called some friends of mine at the church there in Monterey. Remember, I was at the Language Institute in Monterey. And that's where I met Esther. So I still had some friends in Monterey, and I said, "Hey, will you pick me up some clothes and then come get me for church Sunday morning?" Because I wanted to see our old friends and so on. So at the end of our ward was an outside door. I just went out the door, and I didn't sign out or anything like that. I just left and went to church. So I walked into church. And the pastor saw me and he got all excited. He said, "Well, you gotta tell me, you gotta tell the congregation what you've been doing since you left here." So I gave him a quick synopsis and everything, without realizing that their church services, or without remembering, their church services were live broadcast on radio. So when I got back to the hospital, one of the corpsmen came down to the room and he said, "So, you decided to go to church without telling any of us, is that it?" And I looked at him and I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "I heard you." He says, "We listen to the church services here. I heard you." Technically I was AWOL. And unfortunately, the doc had come by while I was AWOL, and he was going to pull my stitches and release me. So I missed that. So Monday morning, I made sure I was in my rack when he came by, and Corman came in to pull my stitches. And one of the stitches had already adhesed to the scar tissue, and he couldn't get it out. He said, "We're going to have to call a doctor." And I said, "No, my wife is already on the way here to pick me up." He said, "Well, we're going to have to delay that. I got to call the doctor to get this thing out." And I said, "Just clip it off at the skin and leave it." And he says, "No." He says, "I'm sorry, sir." He said, "But I got to get that out." the corpsman was a Spec 4, an E4. And I said, young man, I'm giving you a direct order. Clip it off at the skin and leave it. So he did. Came home on convalescent leave. Esther was living with in the other half of a duplex that her brother owned. They lived on one side and we lived on the other side. And so we're sitting there in Esther's brother's living room, and just 2 blocks up the street now this is in Fresno, California, is Blackmore. And Blackmore, at the street that we lived on, hit at the apex of the hill. So you got cars that are powering, coming up the hill, and then as they start down, they let off on the accelerator. What happens? Fire. And it happened. I do not remember moving. The next thing I remember is her brother, Norman, standing over me, looking at me like I was demented because I was on the ground digging with my hands through his front lawn, trying to get under cover. At one point, Esther said to me, she says, how did you sleep in the jungle? And I said, we turn off the trail and circle up in the jungle and cut a little bit of a perimeter. And she said, no. She said, how did you sleep? I said, well, I always was off center in that perimeter, and my rucksack was at my head, and my rifle was on my left side, so I could reach across and pick it up. And I said, that's how I slept. And I said, why? And she said, you're starting to scare me. At night, you'll sit up in the middle of the night, and you'll point at the refrigerator and say, there he is, he's there. Get him. And I didn't remember anything. And she asked me to go over that again, and I did. And she got up and walked over to the closet and pulled my rifle, my personal rifle, out and laid it down on that side of the bed because I was sleeping on that side. She laid it down on the floor beside me, and I slept like a baby. Things like that happen.
Brian sought counseling for his PTSD, but it wasn't easy for him.
She called my name, and it was 27 steps from the seat that I was in the lobby to the seat in her office. And those are the longest 27 steps I ever took. And it was because I was afraid of, and she asked me about this, and we talked about it. I was afraid of the doors that she would open. Because all I remember was the funny stuff. You know, the stepping over the ball, the being fed these little bitty red peppers by our hooch maids in Da Nang. We lived in hooches in Da Nang, and we had civilians, Vietnamese civilians, come in, and they would take care of our hooches. They'd clean up and so on. Well, they brought their lunches with them, and I like peppers. And this gal was eating these peppers, and I asked her about what they were, and are they good? She gave me one. Oh, I couldn't find enough water. But stuff like that you remember, and I guess it makes all the rest of it. It's the sugar that turns an otherwise sour meal edible. Does that make sense? I, to this day, have a real problem with anger. And I would get angry before I was in the service, but nothing like afterwards. And I spent 3 years, I think it was, in counseling over everything. I came to the realization, and I talked to my counselor about this, and I said to her, I'm broken, aren't I? And she said, yeah. I said, I'm never going to heal, am I? And she said, No, Brian, you're not. And that was coming to a conclusion. That was probably the hardest spot for me. This morning, when we went to breakfast, I sat with my back to the wall. That's normal for me. Go into a restaurant, even going into a room, even the church auditorium. I step inside the door and I scan the entire thing. Yeah, okay. Safe. I can go sit down, but I sit in the back row. And the security team worked with them a little bit because of my law enforcement background. And they're used to knowing where I am, and they're used to knowing how I'm going to react to things. But all of that, you change. And it's difficult to come to the realization that you're not like everybody else anymore. 4th of July is coming up. That's a tough time for me. We don't have fireworks here anymore, and the fireworks are just 3/4 of a mile over that way.
Mm-hmm.
So you hear everything. And the mortars that go off in a fireworks, you listen to them. When they go off, it's kind of a crump sound, just exactly like an 81 millimeter mortar. And when they pop in the air, it's the same sound as an illumination round out of a mortar going off. And so you're hearing those things over again. I won't do MRIs anymore. The noise and the tempo, there's a couple of bang, 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 bang in an MRI. And the tempo of one, the loudest one, is the same and the same sound as a 50 caliber machine gun that's had the timing set back a little bit. And so you hear that. And then there's another one that's a little bit lighter in sound, but faster. And that's the same, it's identical to an M60 machine gun. And so I don't do them anymore. You figure out something else, Doc. I'm not going in. This room used to be our family room. And my easy chair was here in the corner. We live, well, if you came off Kip Road, you saw the airport over here. And 238th Aviation Battalion is in Grand Ledge. And it's a helicopter outfit, and they will fly over here. The landing pattern is just outside of us there, coming all the way around, and then you come into the airfield. And one Sunday she came home from church, and she found me in the corner. I'd worked the night shift, so I was still half asleep. I heard the birds come over. Scared the daylights out of me. And from the other end of the house, I come down here. It was the only place I could think of to hide. So there were changes. I've got a friend he's a Marine, and Mike did 18 months over there, and he was Force Recon in the Marine Corps. And those guys were bad dudes. And they got into an awful lot of crap. He was there during Tet of 68, and he fought in that war, or in that battle, and he was on Hamburger Hill. And I didn't see an awful lot of combat like Mike did or so on. And when I went through counseling, there was a level of, you know what survivor's remorse is? That was pretty strong with me. And I had difficulty processing that because I hadn't, but yet I was hurting very badly. And I mentioned that to my counselor. And she says, it's not how much you have seen that causes difficulty with PTSD. It's what you did do. How did that compare with the way you were raised? Well, You knew Grandpa well enough to know how he treated other people. He was always kind, always cared about others. I don't know if you remember it, but when he would pray at a meal or something like that, he always ended his prayers. He had a habit of ending them with, make us mindful of the needs of others. That was real uppermost in his mind. And she wanted to know how I was raised, so I shared all this with her. And she said, Brian, she said, there it is. You may not have faced a lot of combat, but what you did do was so contrary to the way you were raised. She said, you're dealing with guilt. You're dealing with something called cognitive dissonance. She said, that explains to me what you're feeling, what you're going through. Whether it's in combat, whether it's in a self-defense situation, whether it's in law enforcement, it doesn't matter. You're taking a life. And the thing that we all have inside of us, whether we admit or not, there is a knowledge that we are created in the image of God, Imago Dei. And it's that knowledge causes this thing to go sideways when you kill somebody.
Another thing that Brian, as a Vietnam veteran, had to learn to handle was the American public's perception of the war. It was very controversial, and the military was under the media's microscope for the first time. One fellow soldier told Brian he was ordered onto a return flight to the continental United States when he still had his rifle and grenades.
He got off in his full combat gear, and now he's on American soil, and people were going absolutely nuts, and he's kind of looking around going, excuse me, I didn't make this decision. This is the way I was told to get on the plane, and now I'm here. And you hear about the old joke, the guy sits down at the dinner. In the morning, he's in Vietnam. The next afternoon, he's sitting down at the dinner table at his house. And it's parsley, effing butter. And, well, that's what it was like. It took me quite a while. I was on 30 days convalescent leave. And it took me every bit of that to figure out how to behave like a non-combat person. And then I got a phone call from personnel at Fort Ord, and they said, Lieutenant Vissers, what are you still going home? And I said, well, what do you mean? They said, you were to report to Germany yesterday. Why are you not there? And I said, well, probably because I didn't get any orders. And there was a long silence. She says, oh my gosh, they're still here. And now September has passed. And of course, what happens on the 1st of October?
Bow season started on October 1st. So Brian had a chance to stop home and go bow hunting with his dad and brother.
And I remember that day. It was weird because what we were doing is we were still hunting in this woods we were going through, and it was an awful lot of deja vu. I had difficulty that day, but it was good. It was part of the process of returning. And we got done, and then I went on to Germany. When I was on my way to Germany and stopped home, Dad picked me up at the airport, and I was to get military rates on the flight. I was in uniform, dress uniform, and Dad had to stop at a store on the way home to pick up something. As we went into the store, a young man came out of the store, saw me, walked over and spit on me. And the unfortunate thing is, I knew who he was the youngest Herrick boy. And the only thing that kept me from prison was my dad. He grabbed me immediately and kept saying, it's not worth it. It's not worth it, because I'd have killed him. I used that not loosely. I would have at least put him in critical care. That's how strongly I felt, to be treated that way for what I had done. On the other hand, earlier that year, when I was on convalescent leave, came home, I think it was for the 4th of July. And I remember sitting in the entrance to the garage. We were barbecuing. Uncle Bob was there. And he said very pointedly, "Thank you. How you doing?" And he was asking questions. And I felt so good about that Uncle Bob would show that much interest. Not that the other family didn't, but that's the part that stuck out in my mind.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Preserving Valor. If you're enjoying Brian's story, please consider subscribing and sharing the podcast with a friend. Support from listeners like you is key to the continuation of our mission. Join us next time to continue with Brian Vissers' story, and as always, a huge thank you to Brian and the veterans who served along with him.